One of the cool things about James Bond is the element of luck. Am I right? There are times where he should have been, gone, but something intervenes, and just he's a lucky guy. When Ron and I conceived the event, and we saw this book, Ron owns the book, and I said, oh my God, wouldn't it be great if he was ever passing through America? And I tracked him, well, not really tracked him down, I sent an email to this man, and turns out he's in America, and I said, if by some miracle you're ever in the Bay Area, well, I'm coming to the Bay Area at the end of February, oh my God, wait a second, we can make this happen. And he's here now. It just worked out timing-wise that he had a conference in Silicon Valley. Please welcome, I want to make sure I get all the details right here because he's a busy guy. Writer, pop culture historian, speaker, and author of James Bond, The History of Illustrated 007, Mr. Alan J. Porter.
Thank you. Wow, what a turnout. That's amazing. I actually said to my wife this morning, if we get more than one person, I'll be happy because that will be better than my worst ever book signing, because I actually did one when nobody ever turned up. Anytime I do a signing or an event, if there's more than one person, I'm happy. So, as Mike mentioned, we actually came here all the way from Illinois. We probably figured out this is not a Midwestern accent. We've actually been in the States about 20 years, but the funny voice never seems to go away for some reason. So, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book on the history of James Bond in comics. I've always been fascinated by Bond, and what really struck me was when I was at high school, I used to go into the library every morning, where our teachers told us, you go to the library before school starts and read the daily newspapers so you'll be up on current events. And as soon as I discovered the Daily Express with the daily James Bond strip, yeah, I was in the library every morning, but it was not current events I was reading. But a few years ago, I figured out, or found out, that Bond had actually been published all over the world, and in fact, more James Bond stories have been told in comics format than any other medium. There's 145 original James Bond stories told in comics format, which is way more than the movies, way more than any of the novels. The longest tenured and most prolific James Bond author is not John Gardner, as many trivia quizzes would have you believe, but it's actually the guy who wrote Jim Lawrence, the guy who wrote the newspaper strip for 25 years. He wrote more James Bond stories than anybody else. But as I was sort of researching, I found most of the official James Bond books would say, and there was a newspaper strip for 25 years, end of sentence, and that would be it. I thought this was the great secret history of Bond that nobody had ever really dug into or talked about. So part of the idea of the book was to go out and find as many James Bond stories around the world as we could, and give a little publishing history, plot summaries, notes, and artwork. So what I'm going to do today is sort of run through a sort of a guided world tour and history of James Bond in comics. So I'm often asked, where did I actually first discover Bond? I think it's any Bond's fan, it's the usual question, what was your first Bond, where did you find it? First time I ever actually discovered Bond, I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and my friend got the Thunderball board game for Christmas. I had no idea what Thunderball was, I had no idea who James Bond was. But I spent 2 weeks playing around with these little plastic frogs, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I must have gone on and on and on about it, because of that Christmas, my parents bought me the James Bond Annual and the Corky DB5. And I was hooked. I had never read the books, never seen the movie, I was just saying, it was a cool toy and a cool book. It actually taught you how to do judo throws. I never actually mastered it, but it was good fun. So actually the first movie I went to see was On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I was 10 years old, my father took me to see On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And I will admit, I'm a big car guy, so I always have been from being a small kid. So the stock car racing scene, I was like, wow, bobsleighing was great. But when the guy went underneath the snowblower, I was hooked. And that line about, oh, he had lots of guts, back 10 years old, like cracked me up, and it was great. We walked out of the movie theatre, and my father's car had been broken into. The radio was stolen, and I was desperately looking for a snowblower because I wanted to go after the back. Unfortunately, they didn't have a lot of snowblowers in Manchester, England, or that sort of thing. But I was pretty much hooked from Bond from that moment on. So this just sort of get into the history of Bond a little bit. This is actually Bond as Ian Fleming saw him. Nothing like Connery, Moore, Dalton, or Brosnan, or Craig, or any of the movie incarnations. The one on on this side, my right or left, is actually, you never find out the name of the artist, but this was actually commissioned by Ian Fleming, and it's the only known illustration of Bond as Fleming actually describing it to somebody else and from the book. Usually said he looked a bit like the movie actor Cody Carmichael from that period. And the other one is a more modern interpretation of the same description by comics artist Mike Capozzola, who he was working with. So, just to say, most people's idea of Bond is actually nothing like Ian Fleming's idea of Bond. Bond for Fleming was very much a wartime British, upper class, slick back hair, stiff upper lip type guy, not really a man of action. So Bond really arrived as a comics character in just a couple of years after Casino Royale in 1958 in the Daily Express, drawn by John McCluskey. Fleming had actually been approached a couple of times to do an adaptation of Bond in comic strip format, and he didn't want to do it. He thought comics and comic strips and newspaper strips were below him. But the Daily Express had a cunning plan. They offered him money. And there was two things that Fleming never said no to: women and money. And they offered him actually a pretty good amount of money. They offered him £1,500 for every adaptation they did, which back in 1958 was actually a pretty sizable amount of money. It's about what CBS had paid him for the TV rights to Casino Royale a couple of years before. So to get that for every story, well, that was pretty neat. So his first thing was, yes, I'll do it, but it has to be literary. So they got their literary editor, a guy called Henry Gamage, to actually do the first adaptation. So to make sure Fleming was pleased with it. And once Fleming was pleased with it, they put the literary editor on and just put some hack comic writer on. Now, the comic writers were really good, but as long as Fleming was happy with the first one, we were good. So this was Bond's actually first appearance as a drawn character, was actually in these promotional posters that appeared up around London for the Daily Express. So this is the title strip from the first one, and you actually look at Bond on the ace, the playing card here, the ace, actually was slightly different from Bond in the lower ones. All drawn by John McCluskey. What I like here is actually the famous or infamous torture scene from Casino Royale, and how you get around that in a newspaper strip that could be read by anybody. He really just zeroed in on Bond's face and left the rest to your imagination, which when I was reading it, as a young kid, had a much bigger impact on me. What's in your imagination is far worse than what people tend to throw on the page. One of the things I liked about McCluskey's art was always very moody, very dark, lots of shading. As Graham just said, it was also, the more I read, he did really, like a lot of British artists at that time, he would actually get models in and get people to pose on the right things, so rather than just pulling it straight out of his head, he would actually sort of do a lot of real life art. So the Bond strip went on, and they just went through adapting the novels, the Fleming novels, until they got to Thunderball. Now, I'm sure most of you, if you're Bond fans, you may know the story behind the fact that Thunderball was always trouble around Thunderball, there was always trouble with the rights around the Thunderball movie. Similar thing happened with the Thunderball newspaper strip. They were in the Daily Express, which was owned by Lord Beaverbrook, who was a friend of Fleming's. And just as the Thunderball strip started to run, Fleming sold a short story to the Sunday Times. And Lord Beaverbrook was not happy that Fleming had sold the short story to the Sunday Times because he thought he had an exclusive deal with him. So he pulled Thunderball mid-story and basically said, wrap it up in one strip. So halfway through Thunderball, Bond suddenly gets wounded, and then you have the next strip where basically he wakes up in hospital and Felix Leiter says, oh, we fixed it all, we found the Bond, we beat the bad guys. And that was it. So it was all this great build-up, and then it's like, I don't know, it's like Patrick Duffy stepping out of the... Oh, okay, it was all a dream, it was all sorts. So they ran through the Fleming stories until they got to The Spy Who Loved Me. The Spy Who Loved Me is interesting. Fleming said he would not allow it to be adapted in his lifetime, so he had to wait until he died. And if you've read The Spy Who Loved Me, Bond doesn't actually appear in it until he's about a third of the way into the book. It's all told from the viewpoint of the female protagonist, not Bond. So it's like, how do you adapt that into a strip? So Jim Lawrence, the new writer, American writer on the strip, took one line out of the original short story and concocted this whole front half of the story about Bond going off and trying to find this supersonic fighter and introducing a female Madam Spectre and all this sort of stuff. So that started the strip. And about halfway through the strip, it sort of segued neatly into the short story or the Fleming novel. So this was sort of the first, if you like, unofficial Bond continuation story. That Bond sort of wrote this little prequel. He never got credit for it. It didn't appear in public as credit. Turn the next one. By the next story, the Harpies, they would run out of Bond's Fleming stories. So this is actually the first official James Bond continuation story. It was not Colonel's Son. The first official James Bond continuation story was actually the Harpies in the Daily Express. And it appeared about 2 months before Colonel's Son was published. So if you like, the first non-Fleming Bond story. As Mike said, these stories ran for about 6 months. I mean, it was 3 panels of Bond walks in the room, picks up the telephone, says hello, and then it's then it's the next day, go away for the next day, and so forth. So it takes about 6 months to work through one of these stories, but they are really, really cool stories. Next one. So after about 20 years, the Bond strip fell into a little hiatus, and the owners of the Daily Express decided that Bond was getting a little too popular for the Daily Express. So they moved it to their more downstream tabloid called the Daily Star. Starting with a story called Doomcrack, and made the brilliant hiring decision that they wanted a new artist. And they went through and looked at some of the Bond stuff that was been doing. They thought they found the ideal artist with an artist called Harry North. And the top strip was from Doomcrack. Does anybody sort of recognize the style? Mad Magazine, yes. They hired him because they loved what he did with the Octopussy strip in Mad Magazine. They thought he got the likenesses right, so they hired him to do the serious Bond strip. It didn't really work. He was off that strip by the end of the run. And then the one below it, Paradise Plot, was the last Bond strip. It marked the end of 25 years of James Bond strips in the newspapers. And a bit like Thunderball, it sort of peters out in the end, but there is halfway through, but there's actually no neat 3-panel wrap-up for this one. It literally just fades out and that's it. 25 years of continuous Bond stories in the newspaper strips, and they just petered out and disappeared, which was a real shame. I will say, if you want to read these, the British company Titan Books, I noticed we had a couple on the auction table, they did a 17-volume reprint series where they reprinted every single one of these stories. And you can get them at most good comic book stores or online, or I think from Titan Books online as well. Highly recommend it. Great addition to a Bond library, and lots of really original good stories in there. So, all right, one more. So just before we leave the UK, what about the movies, the movie adaptations? So in the UK, there's only really been one movie adaptation produced in the UK, and that was an adaptation of the first Bond movie, Dr. No, which they put out under the UK version of Classics Illustrated. But if you look very carefully, the 1 shilling and threepence pricing there is basically cut and paste and stuck over the American pricing. But it was actually written and drawn by a guy who had no previous experience of writing comics. He was actually a map maker, and they gave him the task of doing the adaptation for Dr. No. So it's very flat, very staid, and doesn't quite meet the script. He went off the shooting script rather than actually what was filmed, so there's some subtle differences between the two stories. But this was actually taken and reprinted and launched a lot of James Bond comics around Europe because this was the starting point when the movie was getting popular. So, yeah, we'll start going on a little world tour. That was the UK. So Cuba. Believe it or not, in Cuba they had 59 issues of their own James Bond stories, all written and produced in Cuba. They did a combination of adaptation of the novels. They did their own original stories. They had a prequel to Casino Royale that they produced. How you managed to get a prequel to Casino Royale, I've not quite worked out. My Cuban's not good, or Spanish is not good enough to actually figure that one out. But they had these beautiful painted covers, and they were all mainly written and drawn by one guy, a guy called Jermaine Gabler. And when I was writing the book, I actually discovered he was now actually living in LA as a screenwriter. I actually wanted to interview him for the book, but he didn't want to. I don't think he liked the fact I actually found him. He didn't want to be interviewed, which was a real shame because I would have loved to have found stories. But one thing he did tell me was, I was like, why did you get to 59 is an odd number for a series? And he was like, by the time we were in the mid-50s, the government had changed in Cuba, and producing 007 was not necessarily seen as the right thing to be doing. And he was handed out of the country because he wrote the James Bond comic book. So it's a real shame. Great talent. I'd love to find out more from him. So Denmark, I love the comics that came out of Denmark. When they started off, they did these great painted covers, usually with Sean Connery, as you can see. They tried to do a sort of a George Lazenby. These were actually mainly reprints of the British comic strips, translated into Danish, and they were also done for Sweden and Norway and many of the other Scandinavian countries, usually with the same painted covers. By the time they got to later on, the sort of Roger Moore era, they would take any still from any movie and slap it onto sometimes a completely inappropriate cover for the story that was inside. So you can actually see the Goldfinger still is on top of a copy of Diamonds Are Forever. And the Roger Moore in the Shake outfit is on top of a reprint of Casino Royale. So they were just taking whatever was from the latest movie and just slapping it on the cover, which is a real shame, because I said they started off really great with these really nicely painted covers that they did it. Germany, in my view, takes the prize for the worst designed James Bond covers. They didn't really put much effort into doing their own covers. Here we have a Casino Royale and the Dr. No adaptation. I don't think they'd actually taken any typography classes or cover design. I don't know what they were going on there. Next one. I love these. These are from India. I actually have this one with me, if anybody wants to take a look at it. But it's, as you can tell from the cover, this is for your eyes only. I don't remember the air crash of For Your Eyes Only. The other one, Super Duper, I have no idea what it is. But it looks really cool, because I ride a motorbike and it's got a motorbike on it. So, yeah. Japanese, Japan, this was fun. A Japanese publishing company was given the rights to produce comics based on 4 of the Bond novels. As you can probably tell, this one's from Goldfinger. You all remember the motorcycles chasing from Goldfinger. But the fun thing was they basically beat Eon Productions to the game, because they would take the title and maybe 3 of the characters and throw everything else out and make their own stories, which is pretty much what the movie company ended up doing. But Ian Fleming Productions was not amused. After 4 books, they pulled the license and said, you can't do it anymore. So the artist on this went, okay. So he basically took Bond's tuxedo off, gave him a dark suit, called him Gogol 13, and that series has been running 25 years, it's been up to about 40 volumes now. So if you want to see a really ultra-violent modern Bond, go pick up some volumes of Gogol 14, the manga, it's really cool. And it is James Bond, everything but name. The interesting thing, they also, too quick, Joe. These were actually also picked up in China, and you can actually still, I've been told, pick up copies of these in Hong Kong and so forth with these Japanese ones. I'm going to be in Hong Kong myself in a couple of weeks, so I'm going to see if I can pick some out. Yeah. Next one. I love these. This is from Russia. Imagine Russia doing James Bond. Doesn't quite fit, does it? I love these because they look like romance novels. Again, I have no idea what the story is. It's a translated version of one of the newspaper strips, but I don't know. Anybody got any ideas? I don't speak Russian. So.
Ask the bartender. No, seriously, he speaks Russian.
Next one. I love these. These are from Sri Lanka. They do 2 editions of every story. They do one in Tamil, which you get in black and white. And then you do one in English, which you get in colour, same story. But what they do is they take the Swedish translation of what was the original English newspaper strip, translate it into Tamil, and then translate it back into English. Yeah, think about it. There is a website, I Google it, Bad Bond Translations. They are hilarious. They're really, I actually do translation stuff in my day job, so I know how difficult it is, so I shouldn't really laugh, but they are good for a laugh over a cup of coffee. Really good. But, next one. Sweden. In Sweden, they, again, like Denmark, they used a lot of the same covers, started off by reprinting the a lot of the newspaper strips and translated them into Swedish, which again, as I said, the guys in Sri Lanka have now taken and retranslated them. By about the mid-80s, they'd sort of run out of newspaper strips, and they were looking for something else to do. It's probably the wrong way to put this, but luckily Ian Fleming's widow died. Because up until while she was around, she was like, you can't do any new Bond stories beyond what's been beyond Colonel Sutton. She wouldn't allow it. When she died, the floodgates opened, and you got the John Gardner novels and stuff, and the Swedish guys were like, can we write some new comic books? And they were given the license to go off and create some new Bond stories. So they started creating some really good Bond stories. Some of them really good. There's a couple of good thrillers, one of which actually they took and made a movie in Norway, and they changed the character's name from James Bond to something else. It was about treasure hunting on a sunken ship in the North Sea. A really good thriller, won lots of movie awards in Scandinavia and Norway, really cool. But they started to run out of ideas pretty quickly. And as they started to do them, you got great things like Bond and Felix Leiter actually tracked down the villain by going to a real estate agent who specializes in finding layers for bad guys. The best one for me, though, was the story where they actually managed to get the Millennium Falcon into a James Bond story. You have to look carefully, it's in the background flying in, but it is in. So we come back to the good old USA and how has Bond fared in the USA. Actually, when I talk to a lot of people, they're very surprised that there really hasn't been, Bond has never really been a success in comic books in the US. Nobody in the US has really known what to do with James Bond in comics. So the first US appearance was actually DC Comics, who had the rights to do the movie adaptation of Dr. No. They put it in their showcase title, which was a good title. That's where the Flash first started, and lots of new characters started in Dr. No. So what did they do? They put a new cover on it that reflected the movie. They released it 3 months before the movie came out. So it had gone from the newsstand by the time the movie came out. So, they took the Classics Illustrated interior, changed the skin tones, so everybody was Caucasian, and changed some of the dialogue. So it was a complete mess. So of course they looked at the sales figures and went, well, this James Bond character's no good, we're never going to do anything with him. So they sat on the license for about 10 or 15 years and did nothing with James Bond. Right at the height of all Bond mania in the 60s and the early 70s, DC Comics had the license, and they kept looking back at the sales figures to showcase and going, oh, this Bond character doesn't sell in comics, we're not doing anything. This is a glimpse of what could have been. This is actually from a proposal put together by a writer called Cary Bates and an artist called Jim Aparo. And if you're a DC Comics fan, Jim Aparo is one of the best guys. He was going to write it, draw it. Cary Bates was going to write it. Cary Bates actually went on to write one of the early drafts of the Spy Who Loved Me movie. But DC Comics looked at this and went, yeah, Bond doesn't sell, put it in a drawer, and forgot about it. Horrible. It could have been so good. So, and we never got to see it, so next one. So things sat with them until halfway through the Roger Moore era, Marvel got the license. And they did For Your Eyes Only, they did a short adaptation of For Your Eyes Only, and they did a one-off of Octopussy. If you actually read the Octopussy one, it reads like it was originally meant to be 2 or 3 issues that they cobbled together and did in one giant size issue. Next one. And the art on For Your Eyes Only was done by Howard Chaykin. This is very early Howard Chaykin, it's nothing like his current style. Likeness of Roger Moore is, I don't know, not really there. It's a little shaky. I certainly don't remember the scene where the car went off a cliff. I know it went downhill, but I don't really remember it going off a cliff in For Your Eyes Only. And obviously the colouring, this was obviously done from an early shooting script. So again, mediocre sales. So Marvel were like, okay, we're done. Next one. So it then went to a company called Eclipse, which was a very short-lived publishing company. They started off with License to Kill. The problem with License to Kill was they actually got the rights to do the comic strip before Timothy Dalton was cast, because originally it was going to be Pierce Brosnan. So when they were drawing it, they had no idea what actor was going to play it. But one of the artists who did the layouts for that was Mike Grell, and they liked the layout so much, Grell got permission to do the first original James Bond comic in the US, which was actually a really excellent series called Permission to Die. Grell is a very knowledgeable, long-lived Bond fan. He pulled in as much as he could from the movies and the Fleming novels, the John Gardner books at the time, as well as his own particular spin on Bond. It's a really nice one. So the small one here on my right is from License to Kill. As you can tell, it doesn't really look like Timothy Dalton. It doesn't really look like any particular actor. It's a sort of generic Bond. Part of what was going on with that, though, they actually ended up with like 4 or 5 writers and 4 or 5 artists working on it. So as you work through the book, Bond's face sort of morphs because there was no clear model of what he was meant to look like. So every artist did their own interpretation. So you're flicking from page to page, and it's like, is that Bond? I have to go back and check. As opposed to Grell, who, as I said, was very much a Bond traditionalist. So he threw in pretty much, everything he could. I love this page because it's got all those stuff. It's got Money Penny, it's got the hat rack, it's got the DB5, it's got M's door on it, and it's a really, really cool series, and it's pretty readily available, and you can find it at back issue bins and comic conventions quite easily. Highly recommend Mission to Kill if you get a chance to read it. The license then went to a company called Dark Horse Comics, who were well known up until a couple of months ago for doing Star Wars. They had Star Wars license for many, many years. They do a lot of licensed books. They started off with Serpent's Tooth. This is actually probably the most reprinted Bond story in the world. Virtually every country that's ever had Bond stories has got a reprint of Serpent's Tooth. It's very stylish, very off the wall, full of gadgets. It's full of spy gear and vixens and stuff. Very cool. But they weren't allowed to use anything from the movies because it was licensed by Ian Fleming Publications. They weren't allowed to use anything from the movies. They got a little close sometimes, and they sort of had to do it away. But again, it's a very stylish looking book. And they did 3 separate mini-series which are all linked, but also in their weekly Dark Horse Comics, they actually did a couple of strips, one of which was really interesting because it was the first Bond sequel. They actually did sort of a sequel to From Russia with Love. It was one of the first original Bond period pieces, actually set in the 60s as opposed to it being a contemporary interpretation of Bond. And again, well worth looking at if you can find them. And this is actually one of the colour guides from one of the Bond Dark Horse ones. So it's a nice painted fluid art style as opposed to the cartoony stuff of the others. Then we come to Goldeneye, and this is where the wheels fell off. A top company, who probably actually better known for doing trading cards, but they actually at one point had a very good comic book line, got the license to do Goldeneye. And they did the first issue, and it was a really hot seller. And everybody was very happy, and then they turned in the second issue to Eon Publications for approval, and there was that nice cover with on a top of Bond. And Eon Studios Productions went, it's too sexy, it's too graphic. And it's like, it's exactly what's in the movie. And they're like, no, it's a comic book. It can't be too sexy, it can't be too graphic. So they killed it, and they didn't allow it to be published. So issue 1 went out, issue 2 and 3 were never published. And that was it. That was the last Bond comic book. Because from that day onwards, they have never, ever approved, either Ian Fleming Publications or Ian Productions approved any more Bonding comics. I've actually been involved with 3 attempts. Since I wrote this book, I've had comic publishers call me up and say, we want to do Bond, can we go get a license? Who do we call? And I'm like, if I can write it, I'll give you the name. And we've had 3 separate attempts to actually get either Ian Fleming Productions or Eon Studios to give us the rights to do a Bond movie, and a Bond comic book, and it just isn't happening. The closest happened in the UK, they did actually do a graphic novel adaptation of one of the old Bond books. But they only did the first one, and I'm guessing it didn't sell very well because they haven't done any more. So it didn't really help the cause in terms of trying to generate interest. So real shame, because I think there's a great potential to really bring this. So there's been no Bond comics since 1995. So all of you, write to Ian Fleming Publications. So if you license Alan Porter to write a Bond comic book, I will buy millions of them. Oh, by the way, do you want to go back to that? I actually do have with me the 2nd and 3rd issues of Goldeneye. Okay, so if anybody wants to take a look at them, you didn't see them here, it was not me. But I actually do have photostats of the 2nd and 3rd issues of Goldeneye. Interesting, my wife actually read the 2nd issue earlier, and she didn't know the backstory, and after she read it, I was like, so was that too graphic? She's like, no, it's just like the movie. So again, I don't understand what what their problem was, but I do have them with me. I actually also have a copy of a Turkish Bond comic book and a bootleg Chinese production reprint of You Only Live Twice. So it's a bootleg Japanese story translated from a British newspaper script. Really high quality stuff. So that was sort of my journey through bonding comics. I want to give a plug to our next book. Actually, my wife, who's been hitting the buttons, Jill, and myself are co-writing the James Bond Lexicon, which will be out in October 2015. The intention is this is going to be the encyclopedia of everything Bond. There are encyclopedias of the Bond movies, and there are encyclopedias of the Fleming novels. Ours is all the movies, all the Fleming novels, all the Gardner novels, actually every single continuation novel, including Moneypenny Diaries, the Young Bond novels. So far we're up to 50 novels we've read through and done what I can't say. And all the comic books, all the English language comic strips and comic books. It's been like a 3-year project. It should be finished this year and is due to be published next year. So, and I also have with me on my iPad some of the artwork from that. If somebody wants to take a sneak peek at some of the upcoming artwork from that, but it will be out in October 2015, hopefully around the next time Bond 24 comes out, which I believe is starting filming in this October. So we've got about 1.5 years to get it finished and get it out. That's the end of the slideshow. Anybody has any questions?
I'd like to introduce Mr. Ron Evans from the board of the Cartoon Art Museum. We're going to do a little Q&A, and then we're going to have an auction. We have some groovy items that I want to make sure that you get to see and bid on. So please, one more time for Alan Porter.
I gotta give a shout out to Michael, and I have to say, thank you for putting me on the I Helped You Conceive of this event. Basically what happened was about over a year ago, we were at a holiday party with the museum's holiday party, and probably too many margaritas and beers were flowing that night, and I think Skyfall had just come out, and between conversations about Star Wars and The Hobbit, somehow Michael said, hey, we should do some kind of event about James Bond, and I think my contribution was pretty much, yeah, we could do that. From there, this is what happened. So Michael really did most of the heavy lifting here tonight. Before we go into the questions with Alan, I just wanted to say that for folks that don't know, this whole event tonight is also part of the Will Eisner Week celebration. And if you don't know who Will Eisner is, he was the creator of The Spirit, and he was also a very early pioneer in the graphic novel format. So starting today and all the way through next Saturday, there are events all across the country and around the globe honoring him and comics and literacy and graphic novels in general. So I think if you go to, I think it's willeisner.com, you'll probably find a bunch of events there, so you should tell your friends in different cities to check them out. And I think we also had something on the museum's Facebook page. So. And with that, if you're still game, we can open it up for a couple of questions. So anybody in the back there?
Yeah, San Francisco, we're home to a sort of James Bond parody of our own, Trouble with Girls, Less Girls. I just wanted to see if you've read Trouble with Girls and what your opinion on Trouble with Girls is.
Yeah, I have actually. I really enjoyed that book, and I've never really thought of it as a Bond parody, but you're right, it is. I just enjoyed it for itself. Actually, the whole idea of Bond parodies is we were in the original draft of the History of the Illustrated 007. There was going to be a whole chapter on parodies and homages to Bond in comics. I think it ended up coming down to about 1 page because we were running out of room. But that could be a slideshow in itself. I will say one of my favorites, not so much a parody, but one of my favorite Bond appearances is there's actually an issue of S.H.I.E.L.D., a very early issue of S.H.I.E.L.D., where Nick Fury is in the barber shop, which serves as the secret entrance to S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, and there's a knock on the door, and they open the door, and it's a guy in a tuxedo who looks very much like a certain Scottish actor, who is not named, who asks to be let in, and they're like, we don't let guys like you in here, this is S.H.I.E.L.D. And they slam the door in his face, and I always enjoyed that. And there's actually another one of S.H.I.E.L.D. where way before the stupidest gadget of the last 50 years appeared, where they actually do have an invisible car in S.H.I.E.L.D., and they make a remark about this is better than anything that Q Branch could come up with. So there's a whole bunch of those sort of crossover pastiches and things. And a lot of the comic book companies also did homage covers. There's a great cover of the Justice League with Bruce Wayne in a tuxedo, and it basically says, "My name's Wayne, Bruce Wayne." So that was probably a bit longer-winded than you wanted, but...
No, that's great, thank you.
I had a question real quick. So, you obviously were a big fan of the comic strips and on stuff in general, but when you decided, or the project for the book came together, where did you start? I mean, did you have enough of your own sort of background information to go on, or did you just figure, okay, I better start with the first papers, or how did you?
Well, actually, I started, the real genesis with the project was Titan Books, who I mentioned earlier. They were doing with their reprint volumes, they were doing essays in the front of each of the volumes, and I think they got to about volume 9 or 10. I must have been really scraping the bottom of the barrel for essays, because the editor called me up and said, or sent me an email and said, "You've written some stuff about Bond and comics on your blogs, do you want to do an article for us?" And I was like, okay, and we started doing the research, and that article turned out to be 3 articles, it was in 3 volumes. And then that sort of morphed into a book proposal with the publisher who ended up doing it. So yeah, initially it was really pulling from my knowledge of the daily strips, what Titan Books were doing, and I knew about the American books because I'd been reading those. I had a couple of the Swedish ones, but then there's a guy who runs a website called From Sweden with Love, Anders, who I actually believe is in LA today, I couldn't make it out. But he at one point had a database of the comic books around the world that he knew of, so he and I started doing a lot of corresponding, and that sort of took me down to various rabbit holes in terms of, there were books in Cuba. Who knows anything about the books in Cuba? Nobody. Okay, I'm going to go dig and find out. So it was sort of one of those, again, a bit like the Lexicon project. When we started that, we had no idea it was going to be a 3-year project. It was like, we'll do an encyclopedia of James Bond. How hard can that be?
Anybody else?
I got one, I guess. Consider you probably know more about Bond than anyone in the room here. What's your take on the new reboot they've done? I think about reading Dr. No, and there's no room for Bond fighting a giant octopus in the movies. So, I mean, what do you think of the compatibility, I guess?
The new series, sort of the Daniel Craig.
Versus what was?
Yeah. I have a couple of problems with, I love Casino Royale, the movie. I thought they did a good job. I have a couple of problems with it as a reboot. Daniel Craig is way too old to be playing a brand new 00 agent. And if we were going to do a reboot, as much as I love her, and which was great in the part, they should never have put Judi Dench in as Anne, because it completely ruined any sense of continuity. And it made the whole thing a mess in terms of trying to fit the things together. Continuity in Bond is it's a minefield. Just to give you an example, so far in doing the work for the James Bond lexicon, we've identified 13 different incarnations of Bond across all the various media. And trying to fit them together is impossible. But I do have a Skyfall theory, okay? Because when that DB5 turned up in Skyfall, you're like, how the hell did that happen? Because he was new and he didn't do all this stuff, but it's clearly the Goldfinger DB5, because they all know about the red button on the on the gear lever. So the only way this works is you have to forget that the actor changes, okay? And that everything from Dr. No through to, what was the last problem one? Die Another Day. Everything from Dr. No to Die Another Day fits between Quantum of Solace and Skyfall. That's the only way the continuity works, and that he could have that DB5. And it sort of works because Casino Royale was his first one. Quantum of Solace was an immediate sequel to Casino Royale, so that was him as a young agent. In Skyfall, they constantly go on about the fact he's a tired old agent and he's been in this game for years. So what happened between him starting and being a tired old agent? That's when all the other movies happen. You see what I mean?
And the actress that plays him also changes.
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about reboots, but the movies were reboots from the beginning. The first of the Bond films, the bad guys were Spectre, not Smersh.
Correct, yeah. They're just, like I said, when we found 13 different incarnations of Bond, there's always, the basic thing. Yes, he's an agent for the British Secret Service with the codename 007. His parents are Scottish and Swiss. Beyond that, it's pretty much fair game, to be honest, depending on what story you want to tell.
My introduction is reading the novels in order, and Smersh are the bad guys.
Yeah.
The first few ones,
I tell you, Yeah, Mike said earlier about rewatching the Bond movies and trying to get surprised. Watch the Bond movies in the order that the novels were published. That will blow your mind. Okay? I mentioned on Majesty's Secret Service. I really love that movie. It's still my favourite Bond movie. We were lucky enough to. Thank you. I've been lucky enough to spend time with George Lazenby. He's a great guy, and we were lucky enough to see it actually on the big screen again for the first time in years. A couple of years ago in Austin, Texas, and it really holds up well on the big screen. But it always freaks me out when Bond walks into Blofeld's lair, and it's like they don't recognise each other. Yeah. But in the previous movie, Blofeld and Bond were having these conversations, and it's like they don't recognise each other, and they don't realise that their faces have changed. It's like, how does that work? It's like, weren't you the guy with the big scar, and weren't you the guy with the funny Scottish accent?
Anybody else?
Can
you tell us something about the artist, Horak?
Yeah.
I love his style.
Yeah, I love Horak's style. I mentioned Jon McCluskey and the fact I really like, he used a lot of dark shadows and Bonds, particularly on the Fleming adaptations, because the Fleming books are dark. But when they started getting into more of Jim Lawrence's original stories, which are a bit lighter, a bit more science fiction, if you like, a bit more optimistic. And Horak was the Yugoslavian writer. He was born in Yugoslavia, but actually worked in Australia for most of his career. Did a lot of work on the Phantom and other things in Australia before coming to the UK and landing the Bond gig. He had a much more open, fluid style, a lot less lines, and it sort of seemed to really work with Jim Lawrence's. And he actually was the artist on most, other than things like The Dangerous, hiring a Mad magazine artist. Horak was pretty much the constant guy throughout that, and he had a really nice style that I really enjoyed reading, and I think it really suits the Jim Lawrence stories.
Maybe one more, Michael?
I wanted to mention, and you might have even mentioned this, as soon as I got off, I was really sweaty, and I went to go fill up my water bottle, so this could have come up. When John McCluskey drew James Bond, he looked a lot like Sean Connery. But this predated the Connery films by like a decade?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah. 6 years.
I'd read that Connery was backstage in a play in a community theater, and then hey Sean, if they ever make a Bond movie, you could be this guy. Like, do you know about this?
I've heard that story. I don't know if it's apocryphal or true, but
yeah, it was on Connery's website. Like he but McCluskey told me that years later.
From a few stories I've heard about Connery, I think you can probably take a large saucer of salt, I think.
But he did try to sue John McCluskey later for his image, and like this happened before you were Bond, and that ended like the Connery's lawyer, they shut him down with like, this was 10 years before you were Bond, 5 years before you were Bond. Like, okay, thanks for your time.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, as I pointed out, even on the Casino Royale strip, between the very first opening panel that McCluskey drew, and then he was partway into the story, the face of Bond really changed a lot. It was probably about halfway through Casino Royale that really got on model with what he wanted Bond to look like.
How about one more? Anybody? Way back there.
Most of the art that you've shown, it seems like the art that you've shown seems to take after the movie, after the actors have already been established. Are there anything for you, any poignant ones that you know of where the movie was taken from the animation, from the comic?
Actually, yeah. If you go back and read a lot of the newspaper strips, some of the sequences are like, damn, this is a storyboard for one of the later movies.
Dr. No.
Dr. No. Actually, the keel-hauling sequence in the Live and Let Die, the novel, which in the movies they didn't put in the movie, but they actually used it later in For Your Eyes Only. If you go back and actually look at that newspaper strip adaptation, it's almost shot for shot what they used in For Your Eyes Only. There's also one of them where Bond is actually hang gliding years before he did it in Live and Let Die. So yeah, there are certain things when you're reading them. And of course, the short story Risico was actually used as part of that was used in one of the other later Bond For Your Eyes Only. So yeah, if you actually read that, it's like, yeah, this is like a, as I said, almost shot for shot for the movie. So, by the way, the Moneypenny relationship that you see in the movie, the flirt between Bond and Moneypenny, which is so central, is not really in the Fleming books. Moneypenny hardly gets mentioned in the Fleming books.
Which might segue to another thing,
But that started in the comic strips. That flirtation relationship actually started in the comic strips. So, sorry, yeah, we're gonna...
The new Ian Fleming series sort of seems to imply that Ian Fleming and the secretary...
Oh, the Dominic Cooper thing?
Might have been
That's
the
complete
inspiration.
fiction. That's, yeah. That bears no resemblance to Fleming in reality and his wife. And I say that without having seen it, but I've seen some of the clips I've seen. It's like, if you've actually read anything about Fleming, it's like, yeah, nah.
All right, well, I think that's good. Thank you again, Alan.
Thank you very much.
$10. $10 for a great book. Thank you, sir. Do I hear 11? No? Sold. Thank you very much. Who likes to drink? Who likes booze? If you're like me, you like drinks, cocktails. Who else likes James Bond? 007 on the Rocks. It's a signed copy. A guide to the drinks of James Bond. The Octopussy drink. Something for the Bond girls. Live and Let Die. 3 measures of rye whiskey. This is fantastic. This is a great little book. Sells for $15. We're going to start the bidding at $14.99. $14.99. Do I hear 15? 15. Do I hear 16? Who'll give me $25 for a signed copy of 007 on the Rocks, benefiting the Cartoon Art Museum? Sir, 25 going once, twice. Do I hear 30? 20. This gentleman in the back, thank you so much. Someone, you go see that? Sir, can you raise your hand? Thank you. Who remembers my cartoon, Career Day with James Bond? This is the original artwork. It's pen and ink with color on Bristol board. $25. Who will put this on their wall and upset people who come to visit for 25? Sir, 25? Do I hear 26? Sold. I'm going to go get the big items. This guy right here, our champ. What is your name? Chad, thank you.
A good friend of mine works
Guys,
in DC.
have your attention. This is where it gets very exciting. 2 things. If you want to own some of your own original artwork by Jon Bach Martinis, the father of the guy who we Skyped with, Graham, I have these catalogs. You can go through them, treat them like these are the Titan books. You can treat them like catalogs. Write down the name of the strip and the number. There's a number on each strip. If you want to own one, just write it down. We'll get the sheet to Jon Bach Martinis, to Graham Martinis, and you can buy the artwork. I bought one for myself from Moonraker. It's gorgeous. We have one on the wall right around the corner there. This has nothing to do with the silent auction, but before you leave tonight, flip through the catalogs, see if you want to take one home or get one shipped from England. They're amazing. They're one of a kind, obviously. Pen and ink. They're gorgeous. They're maybe like foot and a half. They're incredible. I mentioned that Spoke Art Gallery gave us 18 by 24 James Bond posters. Did anybody go to the Castro for the, you saw the Bond Festival? Yeah. Do you remember when these were there? These are completely sold out, rare, all gone. They're on eBay for $300. So we have 2 separate ones. I'm showing you this one first. It's 18 by 24. Only a few exist in the world. It's on gorgeous watercolor paper. I think it's a cold press process. We're going to start the bidding for this at $150, even though it's worth $300. Do I hear $150 for this gorgeous? Thank you, sir. In the back, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. Thank you for starting the bidding at $150. I want you to know the bidding is going to go up by $25 increments. Do I hear $175 for this gorgeous, one-of-a-kind thing that you can sit on for a few days and it'll triple in value, but it's just too good to give up? Do I hear $175 for this amazing James Bond limited edition, one-of-a-kind print? Just look at her all smug. Pretend you're in a casino scene.
Why do I not have a paddle?
Yeah, we didn't think ahead. Pretend she's a Bond villain and you don't want her to get this. Do I hear $175? Thank you, $175, Chad, good job. Do I hear $200 for this? Who will take that? Chad's been greedy, he's gotten every other item. Who will give me $200 for this? Otherwise, oh, 200. Look at her. Nice, $200. 200 going once, twice. All you have to do is say 225 and you got it. Going 2.5. Nearly. Sir with the ponytail, you look like you own a luxury liner. You want a bid? You look very successful. I'm just going by the tuxedo, the beautiful woman, the ponytail.